Hi, my name is America, and for our group presentation, we are doing the color of law. What you'll see is each of us is going to take two chapters and just do a little review on what we read and just the big major points, and then we're going to go on to the main theme of the book, how the book connects to this class, and lastly, our recommendation. All right, going into chapter one, this chapter really just goes over how segregation was formed in California, specifically in Richmond. So we see the first explicit segregation attempt. So how it happened was that there's a really rapid growth of population, and so homes were being built for white people further inland, while homes for Black people were being built outside the city along railroad tracks, and they were poorly constructed just for like temporary use, as the city would have said. And because of that, segregation patterns exist today due to those decisions that were made just from building homes. And so we'll see that during the Civil War, the government collaborated with private groups to segregate Richmond specifically. So the United Service Organization, USO, maintains separate Black and white clubs in Richmond for military personnel and operates separate Black and white travelers aid services for newly arrived war workers. So those are just two examples of how there was still segregation happening in Richmond. And then to ensure that no African American men migrated to Richmond, the city's police stopped and arrested and jailed men on the street that couldn't prove that they were there for work. Floyd Lowe, president of the California Real Estate Association, set up an office in East Palo Alto to panic white families into listing their homes for sale due to African American families seeking jobs and homes in Palo Alto. This is known as blockbusting, and they would display ads like colored buyers selling homes at an inflated price. So they were trying to get African American families to move there so they could move the whites out into different neighborhoods. And within 6 years, the population in East Palo was 82% Black.
Chapter 2 starts off by explaining how public housing by the government was used to segregate African American into urban ghettos. It spoke on the stereotypes of a ghetto and how there are no amenities like parks or grocery stores, and it is just completely filled with crime and drugs and just a completely rundown area versus white neighborhoods that had parks and grocery stores and nice looking houses. Government housing first became a thing in World War I when it built houses for defense workers near their bases. This, of course, excluded African Americans. The empty housing left after the war was intended to fill a housing shortage, but not people who just couldn't afford it. They were more worried about the economy than housing citizens. Possible tenants in New York were turned away for undesirable traits, and landlords had a list of about 21 traits that they would use against selling to African Americans. One example is not having enough furniture. But it was just another way to segregate our housing. There were so many different examples from so many different states that showed the purpose housing laws that would discriminate against African Americans. One example is in San Francisco. One nonsense way was that they looked like they didn't have enough money, so they couldn't sell them the house. When the Great Depression started, African Americans faced an even bigger housing shortage. This caused President Roosevelt to create the New Deal. The New Deal came from the Great Depression. However, it was strictly segregated by race. African Americans received worse jobs, worse benefits and protection, and as a result of this legislation. Eventually, Tennessee Valley Authority created a model village, but it was only open to whites. Harold Ickes developed the neighborhood composition rule, where the PWA built housing for African Americans, but only neighborhoods that were predominantly African American. The PWA built white or Black public housing in order to change the composition of neighborhoods. In 1935, the PWA took down an integrated Atlanta neighborhood to build a white-only housing that forced African Americans to move and continued to segregate neighborhoods. There were many other examples given about the PWA destroying African American communities in order to make housing for whites. The white neighborhoods had amenities like community centers, playgrounds, gardens, and other things that Black projects did not. In 1949, Harry Truman became president, and proposed the 1949 Housing Act, which continued to segregate and continued to give priority to white people. And the places that were open to integration had mandated local referendums, which led the poor to being vetoed if they were integrated. When Truman became president, his administration required local housing to build separate housing authorities that practiced segregation to build separate projects to house low income Black families in an attempt to address a situation where a large number of white housing was vacant and allowing African Americans to move in. This was only if white families were unable to move in. This chapter mainly spoke about how the housing projects were set up and how vastly different the white neighborhoods were compared to the Black neighborhoods, as well as the many different ways governments and landlords have continued to discriminate against African Americans.
Hello, I'm Lauren, and I'm going to be presenting Chapter 3 on racial zoning, which starts by talking about how there was a lot of animosity in the South towards Black people, and that led to fear and hatred of Blacks across the country. Even in places where they had previously thrived post-Civil War, like Montana, they were expelled. Many towns across America forbid Black people from residing in town borders or even being within them after dark. In 1910, cities began to adopt formal zoning rules that created separate areas for Black and white families. And in 1917, a Supreme Court decision known as Buchanan banned racial assignments for neighborhoods, but cities found loopholes to justify their decisions, such as saying that racial zoning was essential for avoiding racial conflict and encroachment of the colored race damages home values. Other ordinances stated that the reason for the separation was that Black people inherently try to amalgamate with whites, which means engaging in relationships that produce mixed-race children. When planning how land would be used in developing towns, mostly white single-family homes were zoned as first residential, which prohibited construction of anything but single-family homes. If land was in or adjacent to African American neighborhoods, it became designated for future industrial development. This meant industrial, even toxic waste could be put next door to these homes. This turned African American neighborhoods into slums. This type of zoning has two outcomes. First, it attempts to keep Blacks out of white neighborhoods by making it difficult for lower-income families to live in expensive white neighborhoods, and it protects white neighborhoods from deterioration by ensuring that industrial or hazardous businesses could not be built there. The first creates exclusive white suburbs, and the second creates Black slums.
Hi, I'm Carly, and Chapter 4, Own Your Own Home, focused a lot on how African Americans were being kept out of being able to buy homes in white neighborhoods, with discrimination other than zoning. Zoning started being used to keep out African American families, but wasn't stopping middle-class African Americans. This is when the campaign Own Your Own Home really took off because it was used to push white families into feeling a sense of patriotic duty when they owned their own homes. Agents wouldn't even sell to African Americans. The New Deal happened in 1933, and this reinforced these rules because this included families being able to get loans on their homes during the Depression, when people were struggling even more. This gave Homeowners Loan Corporation more control on who was able to buy houses or get loans. It was crazy how even having a barrier to separate neighborhoods from a more at-risk neighborhood made them more reliable for a loan. Richard Rothstein says he constructed a half-mile concrete wall 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and the FHA gave them the loan. They were very selective with who could get a loan. They even started color-coding neighborhoods. When there were African Americans in a neighborhood, it was considered more at risk, so it was colored red, and you couldn't get a loan if you were in a red zone. When trying to get financing for a construction project for an African American housing development, they were denied by FHA. They just kept getting turned down and told they would never get to live in the same neighborhood as white people.
So in Chapter 5, Private Agreements, Government Enforcement, it talks about how even before the FHA actually sponsored the whites-only suburbanization, there were so many neighborhoods that were already racially exclusive. Folks who were a part of these whites-only neighborhood and were for keeping these neighborhoods whites-only would talk amongst themselves, do languages and pacts that would essentially state that they were not to resell or to rent to African American families. But there was actually created by the property owners and builders in order to keep the environment segregated. And then down below is like the typical language from northern New Jersey this was in 1925, that essentially reads that any property that you have or anything that you own can only be shared within the Caucasian race. However, if a member of these neighborhoods and these whites-only neighborhoods wanted to resell or to rent to African American families, the neighbor did have the option to sue these families to get them evicted, but they were never really successful because the contract was actually to be done with the present and the previous owner, not with the neighbor. To get around this, and like to prevent African American families to buy or rent homes in these neighborhoods, there were many subdivision developers that actually created a community association before putting these homes up for initial sale. They made memberships, and there was condition and rules that were to be done before they purchased their homes, that stated that they were not to resell or to rent to African American families, and there was bylaws that included a whites only clause. A lot of this was also done by J.C. Nichols, who did have a lot of projects. That he had about 6,000 homes, 160 apartment buildings, and over 35,000 residents. He required that each purchaser that wanted to get homes from him, rent homes from him, or to rent a place in any of his apartment buildings, he actually required them to join the association. So before purchasing homes, renting apartments, he required them to sign contracts and sign things and look over the rules not to resell or to rent to African American families. This did prohibit sales and rentals to these families, but it was something that was to be done because they wanted to continue to keep these neighborhoods segregated and it to be whites only.
So looking at Chapter 6, this focus on the FHA denying finances to the African Americans in by white neighborhoods, and they said that this causes the house prices to go down, but this wasn't the case because African Americans were paying more for the same housing, and this caused a thing called blockbusting, where people would buy the house at lower prices and sell them back to African Americans. They would hire African Americans to ride around with loud music and have them push their babies around in carts and try to push white people out of the neighborhoods and sell the houses and make more money. These high prices created many issues in the community because African Americans would get evicted if they missed 1 month of their high payments, and they would not get any equity on these. These created issues with parents working multiple jobs, extra roommates, and kids missing schools. Looking into Chapter 7, this chapter focuses on how the IRS contributed to segregation by tax exemption to churches, hospitals, university, neighborhood associations, and other groups. Rothstein explains that the IRS has failed to meet its obligation to withhold tax favoritism from discriminatory organizations. Churches and universities also played a role in this. In big cities, they were also tax exempt, while African Americans were segregated in different areas paying taxes. Looking into homes again, and the banks also contributed to the suppression against African Americans, giving them subprime loans, loans that they couldn't afford. Just continue to do that, and it's even seen in 2008. So this form of discrimination was based on race and not economic status, according to Rothstein.
In Chapter 8, Local Tactics, it mainly talks about David Bohannon and his involvement in creating whites-only neighborhoods. He was actually one of the most active developers. He created the whites-only Rollingwood subdivision outside of Richmond. Within that same year, he created the massive whites-only village about 5 miles south of the Oakland border. This was one of the nation's largest wartime government-insured project. It had more than 5,000 units, 17,000 residents, and this project was actually financed by a $7 million FHA authorized loan from Bank of America and the American Trust Company. It later became obvious that they weren't planning to sell or to rent to Black and African American workers, so the American Friends Service Committee offered to assist Ben Gross in finding a developer who would agree to build an interracial subdivision. Because none of these existing neighborhoods would accept African American and Black folks into their neighborhoods, the American Friends Service Committee decided to build their own. However, along the way, they struggled to do it without being so many restrictions. The first one being financial. The FHA restricted them and prevented them from getting a loan, so they managed to get a favor from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company through a Quaker connection. After the financing was secured, they ended up getting help to look for a building site. They found the first one and they ended up getting local government to get involved, and they rezoned the site from residential to industrial use. They found another one, the same government rejected the proposal. They found another one, and the town stifled it. They found a fourth one, and then the landowner refused to sell it to them when they realized that the project would be integrated. So after going through so many like common segregation tactics, they ended up going through a different one. The city council demanded that the proposed integrated neighborhood meet numerous amounts of rules and conditions before they were able to start. These were not the same rules that David Bohannon had to go through. In fact, David Bohannon didn't have to go through less, if not like any rules, to start doing these whites only neighborhoods. With all this being done, the project was actually canceled.
I'm Carly Watson. In Chapter 9, State-Sanctioned Violence was mainly about the violence that ensued when African Americans moved into those white neighborhoods, and how the police didn't do anything to stop it. African Americans were not allowed to buy houses in these neighborhoods, but sometimes they were sold to them by someone that already lived there or rented to them, because they knew they would pay more. For example, Sidney Hogan sold his property to the Gary family, but then mobs of people gathered because they wanted them to leave. They felt so threatened, but the police didn't even make a single arrest after all the things that were done. This wasn't the only instance that this happened, and I imagine that if something was done to help defend the Gary family, it would have deterred more people in the future. The Myers family experienced something similar to the Gary family, and the threats and acts of violence ultimately ended up forcing them out of the neighborhood. Police just stood there when they were supposed to protect them. They even went so far as to encourage crowds when the Myers family's house was vandalized. There were so many more instances where violent acts were ignored to try to keep the segregation. These circumstances scared African Americans to the point of feeling like they needed to be on their best behavior. One example of the awful violence they faced during this time was explosives being thrown at the house. Richard Rothstein says, in one case, explosives were lobbed at the home of Richard B. Harrison, a well-known Black Shakespearean actor who had purchased a house in a white neighborhood, and the police put no real effort into catching the person who did it. This type of behavior kept continuing.
Chapter 10 is about how the government suppressed incomes of Black people and how the common explanation for de facto segregation that most Black families simply cannot afford to live in white middle-class communities is not entirely legitimate, and looks at how public policy segregated African Americans. Following emancipation, Black people were denied access to free labor markets. Former slaves on plantations were now called sharecroppers, but they maintained the same harsh and exploitive conditions and often owed the plantation owner more than they had earned after food and living costs were deducted. This wasn't allowed until 1951, which is pretty recent. It was very hard for Black people to be employed. When a St. Louis segregated hospital for African Americans was being built, a contractor hired one Black man to set tile. The city fired the contractor and announced it would not use any form of Black labor. As part of FDR's New Deal, the NRA sought to establish fair minimum wages, maximum hours, and set prices across industries. Predominantly white factories tended to have higher minimum wages, under the justification that the cost of living is higher in their neighborhoods. The Delaware plant, with 90% African American workers, was categorized as a Southern and given a lower minimum. Another minimum wage increase in the cotton textile industry resulted in price increases throughout the entire production chain, such as retail clothing. These wage increases bypassed the jobs which African Americans dominated: cleaners, outside crew, and yardmen. The NRA increased the prices of everything they had to buy without increasing their wages whatsoever. In 1935, FDR signed an act allowing unions at construction sites and factories to bargain with management. This inadvertently protected the unions that refused to admit African American members or segregated them into lower paid jobs. In 1964, white-only unions were finally no longer allowed. However, there were no reparations made for the decades of income suppression those unconstitutional unions caused. FDR signed an executive order banning racial discrimination by unions in management and government-controlled war industries. The order created the Fair Employment Practice Committee. FDR ensured the committee's weakness by appointing a pro-segregator as first chairman. The FEPC was ineffective pretty much everywhere. In 2015, New York City's Sheet Metal Workers Union began paying $13 million in compensation to African Americans who received fewer job assignments than white people from 1996 to 2006, which is a good sign. On top of all of this, African Americans were also unable to save much of their wages because some cities had discriminatory property assessments that overly taxed the homes in Black neighborhoods, disallowing them from building wealth. In conclusion, Black people were excluded from the two major wage growth periods for blue-collar workers in American history, World War II production and the subsequent home and highway building boom. They weren't allowed to live in the suburbs being built, nor were they able to benefit financially from building them themselves.
In chapter 11, the author talks about how ending segregation was a lot harder than everyone expected it to be. Even with new laws passing, so many things needed to be undone and done in a new way. One example is ending school segregation. The proposed way to do that was making it so districts could revise their school boundaries and allow African American students and not have them be forced to go to low quality schools. In 2010, the typical African American student attended a school where only 29% of the students were white. Our schools are still being segregated today. Housing segregation has led to school segregation as well. Although the discriminatory acts have passed, it is almost impossible for African Americans to move to nice neighborhoods, so they end up staying where they are. There are a few ways that it was difficult to undo housing segregation. Parents' economic status is replicated into the next generation, so if you are low class, you typically stay low class. Children often replace their parents' status, meaning that it is a constant cycle of white people living in the same house and extremely hard for African Americans to move in. The value of white working families in suburban housing defined racial living agreements because parents would give their assets to their children and make it unable for an African American family to move in. 4 times as many white children inherit wealth from their parents, and they inherit 3 times as much as a black child. 67% of African American families hailing from the poorest quarters of neighborhoods a generation ago continue to live in neighborhoods today. Housing segregation has been around for too long and it is too hard to try and undo, along with the fact that federal, state, and local government has continued to find ways to reinforce residential segregation rather than diminish it. The civil rights laws have passed, and President Kennedy ended federal support for discriminatory home financing, and the Fair Housing Act was passed. The Fair Housing Act was more focused on being affordable than the discrimination of moving African Americans into the suburbs, but still allowed African Americans to live where they choose and can afford. Even after the Fair Housing Act, it was so difficult for African Americans to afford suburban housing. Eventually, the Fair Housing Act was outlawed, and governments still found ways to discriminate against African American neighborhoods. They started building more and more highways and took money from the public transportation, which many African Americans relied on. This chapter finished by speaking on how the low-income neighborhoods lacked job opportunities, good nutritional resources, exposure to drugs and violence, and disadvantages in education and healthcare, and how if the government can satisfy more by using Section 8 funds. Section 8 is a fund that allows landlords to legally refuse to rent to tenants who use housing vouchers and instead using that money to supporting tax credit development in segregated neighborhoods. He finishes by stating that these were just short-term gains that may not be worth the long-term cost. Another quote that I found really interesting at the end of chapter 11 that I felt really summarized the chapter where actions of government and housing cannot be neutral about segregation. They will either exacerbate it or reverse it.
Last but not least is chapter 12. In this chapter, the author kind of gives his last notes on what we can do as a country or on an individual level to start working to desegregate America. First, he kind of dives into the fact that segregation is harmful for children. If you think about it, you have a school with separate classrooms, with separating kids by the way that they look. You're going to grow up with very confusing ideals and ideas of just what normal is. And so it's harmful for both African American children and white children because it deprives all children of exposure to diversity. It also puts handicaps on Black children because teachers tend to view those children as having disadvantages, that they need special attention, that their behavior doesn't match those of their white peers, so there must be something wrong, instead of viewing them as themselves as humans. Next, the author goes in to talk about how we can't just undo years of segregation. There need to be efforts to create a world in which we aren't segregated. Obviously, we are suffering the consequences that have been imposed on us through history, but until there is a real effort, you can't really do much. The author says that the United States needs a full employment policy, minimum wages that return to their historic level and keep up with inflation, and a transportation infrastructure that will make it possible for low-income workers to get a job that are available. They just need to provide an adequate environment for integration efforts, because if we aren't providing the things that they need to get a better job, there needs to be an effort to create the environment for them to grow and for them to go out of the cycles they're living in, just due to history, unfortunately. Another big thing that the author argues is that there needs to be accurate education on how segregation was created, so that the future has a chance to do a better job to desegregate. The author talks about a popular textbook used in middle school and high school called The Americas, Reconstruction to the 21st Century. And in that 1,000-page volume, the author says there's only one line that talks about residential segregation in North America. That reads, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. That one passive line, it kind of reads like it wasn't anybody's fault. They just kind of landed there. That's just how things happen. But we know, based off just what we've learned in these 12 chapters, that that's not how it happened. It was intentional. In this next section of the chapter, the author talks about the Fair Housing Act that came out in 1968 but was planned to be re-implemented under the Obama administration. The Fair Housing Act requires jurisdictions that receive federal funds to affirmatively further the purposes of the law. So the rule instructed cities, towns, suburbs to assess their concentrations or absence of disadvantaged populations and identify goals to remedy segregation conditions. The author also mentions a secretary named George Romney who pushed integration more vigorously than any other person in administration back in 1970, after there was a string of riots across the country. He drew up a plan to withdraw government funding support from segregationist suburbs, but his Republican colleagues hated the idea, completely hated it, and because of that, he was forced to resign due to how outraged the Republicans were. Next, the author talks about how Black middle-class towns also need to be desegregated. Just because they're not living in the ghettos does not mean that they are living to their full capacity. Oftentimes, the youth in those towns have this weird unbalanced exposure to gang life, but also to the unattainable white dominated careers. So there is this unbalance to where they fit in life. Next, the author talks about the National Fair Share Act, which was to mandate that localities be racially and economically diverse and revoke their tax deductions when they are not. So this would give citizens a powerful economic incentive to press their local officials to take reasonable steps towards integration. This act was proposed by John Boger, who was a law professor, and so this would give power to the citizens to make decisions to integrate their own cities. In the final section of this chapter, the author circles back to the family he talked about in the first chapter. The daughter of Frank Stevenson from the first chapter attended a school in Richmond that was deeply segregated and under-resourced, and how she didn't finish college. But he then talks about how their daughters went through the same history and now they're all working relatively low wage jobs. And he's talking about this cycle of segregation and the effects of it. And it's not just back when, before Civil War, we had problems. There are effects that we're facing today because of the decisions that were made post Civil War, and that the American community has an obligation to make sure everyone has an equal opportunity and aren't stuck in these cycles. All right, so now I'm just gonna summarize the whole book with the main themes. These were the two things that kind of stuck out the most to me. The first being that every decision since the Civil War to this day made by the federal, state, and local governments have intentionally and systematically segregated America. I feel like after reading these 12 top chapters, there's no denying that every decision made was intentional to keep segregation in America without crossing legal barriers. Second, I feel like another big main theme was that although it's not our individual faults that we are where we are today with the segregated cities and the big gap between classes, all of the decisions we make today do have an influence on the world that we will see in the future. So it's up to us to make ethical decisions to make sure that we are creating a world that is more equal, whether that is through educational reform or something as simple as shopping at local Black-owned shops to keep the money flowing in the cities rather than through big corporations that we won't ever see again.
This book related quite a bit to our class. It provides examples for how segregation has persisted over time, and it proves that our society doesn't allow Black people to grow wealth or break out of the cycle of poverty and segregation easily. The stories in the book portray how we've gotten to this point, and some examples are once neighborhoods became segregated school districts enforced boundaries, and African American students were forced to stay at low quality schools. Even today, schools tend to be segregated because of where students' families can afford to live. Other groups that we've learned about this term also remain heavily segregated due to public policy and lack of assistance from the government, such as the indigenous groups we read about. So that kind of related to the stories in this book. And it also related a lot to the theory of economic change, or the economic theory of change, as money tended to be a huge factor in what happened in the book.
After finishing the book, my group would definitely recommend this book. It provided many ways on how the discrimination and segregation affected the Black community in the late 50s and 60s, and also how it still affects the community today, while also showcasing how housing segregation led to job segregation and school segregation, and many more ways that the Black community continued to be shunned by society. It also showcased the many ways that segregation could have been addressed back then and how politicians and society decided not to do anything until it was too late.